Former Vice President Mike Pence criticized President Biden's handling of the economy continuously in a speech earlier this week. One issue he did not address was any conflict with former President Trump regarding the 2020 election. Here's the closest he came to even discussing the events related to January 6th.
You know, we've all been through a lot over the last several years. A global pandemic, social unrest, a divisive election, a tragic day in our nation's capital, and an administration seemingly every day driving our economy into the abyss of a socialist welfare state.
For more, let's bring in Yahoo News national politics reporter Tom LoBianco. He's also the author of the 2019 biography of the former vice president entitled Piety and Power. Hey, Tom, good to see you. Thanks so much for being here. So we saw the former vice president yesterday. He spoke for about 40 minutes, but he made no mention of January 6th and the committee hearings where his attorneys were the ones detailing not only Pence's refusal to go along with Trump's, urging to overturn the presidential election, but also how the former president, really personally insulted him. So what do you make of that dynamic and that kind of disconnect?
Yeah, it is. And thank you, Caitlin. It really is the most jarring contrast right now. I think it was right after that speech, too, where he made the comment that the president that has lied the most is President Biden. And this after we heard extensive testimony from his own counsel, Greg Jacob, one of his advisors, former federal judge Michael Ludig, saying that it was Trump who was lying about this, and ultimately showing how this led up to an attack in the Capitol on January 6th, which really threatened Pence's life and the lives of his family. His strategy and the tactic that he's been doing throughout all this, and we've seen this hesitation from him in previous campaign stops. He's been kind of tiptoeing around January 6th. Now it seems to be that he's trying to walk past it. And I guess the question here, and certainly the question that I have is, is that feasible? Is that something realistic? This is a definitional moment in his life and career, perhaps the definitional moment. Recall that Greg Jacobs testified under oath that Pence said that when he wrote that letter on January 6th, detailing his inability to overturn the election results, his inability to throw out electors and receive these fake electors that Trump was pushing, that it was probably the most significant thing he will ever sign in his entire life. Contrast that against his 2024 machinations right now, going to the University of Chicago club on Monday and saying, hey, this was a tragic day in our nation's history, and leaving it at that. I don't know if that's going to work for him.
Yeah, that's such an interesting dynamic, the idea that he could be kind of touting this move that even Democrats are kind of calling courageous, yet wants to kind of put it in the rear view and focus on the economy and inflation and kind of traditional Republican issues. I want to get to a little bit more about Pence's potential ambitions in a moment, but I kind of want to take a little bit of a step back to this rally in Georgia. And I remember covering this at the time in Georgia. It was January 4th, 2021. Listen to what former Vice President Pence said then.
We all got our doubts about the last election. And I want to assure you, I share the concerns of millions of Americans about voting irregularities. And I promise you, come this Wednesday, we'll have our day in Congress. We'll hear the objections. We'll hear the evidence.
So, Tom, given what we know from the hearings, given what his, closest advisors and lawyer testified under oath, Pence probably, had to have known at that point that there was no such evidence for what he was describing. And, his lawyers testified to that, that he had already been pushing back on this Trump pressure not to certify the election. So how do you think, how do you essentially reconcile, those words with what had happened 48 hours later?
reconciling the Pence statements is turned into like a lifetime job. I think for me, I don't know. The short answer is that you don't. Right? What it reminded me of. There's, of course, your colleague at CBS, Bob Costa, and Bob Woodward wrote about this, the Dan Quayle exchange, where he was trying to get out of having to do this on January 6th. What it reminded me of, and I wrote about this in the book, there are two events from even earlier, in 2016 and 2015 in Pence's career. In 2015, he has this big meeting right after the whole RIFRA blow up, which seemed to would have derailed his career at that moment. Before he goes on George Stephanopoulos and gives one of the most terrible interviews he's ever given. Basically, it seems at that point to have killed his career. He had a meeting at the governor's mansion with a small group of top aides, and I talked with a lot of them for the book, and they all came out of the meeting with different interpretations of what Pence said he was going to do.
It's clear that he has his eyes on a presidential run, and I just find it fascinating that unlike some of these other potential 2024 candidates, he's not being deferential to Trump at all. So I'm kind of curious about that strategy, what you make of it, but also what is the Pence constituency in a 2024 primary, Republican primary, given that, he doesn't have this relationship with Donald Trump anymore? I mean, does he need Trump supporters to kind of gain any traction within the Republican Party if he does decide to run?
Well, this is the key question for him right now. It's the key question for anybody looking at 2024, but it's particularly him. I look at the polling numbers that have come out routinely since January of last year, since the attack, frankly, and Pence has been very steady, kind of like a second or third option right behind Trump. If Trump does running neck and neck with DeSantis, his numbers have not been moving in any serious way. And this gets to your question of the constituency. It seems to be older. It seems to be Midwestern. It seems to be evangelical. You see him playing a lot more to the evangelical Christian right. Groups that he'd gotten away from when he was the governor of Indiana and kind of reconnected with when he was with Trump. But it's not clear right now if this, when you look at those numbers and you see him at like 12% support in a hypothetical 2024 field, you don't know whether or not that's a ceiling or a floor for him.
So I guess we'll kind of keep an eye on his travels, whether he starts making these trips to Iowa, New Hampshire, we'll get a better picture. But I know that we will be talking to you a lot over the next several months and in the lead up to 2024. Tom LoBianco, thank you so much for your time and your reporting.
Thank you, Caitlin.